The morning was deceptively tranquil. Willow Creek, with its neat rows of brick-and-siding houses, white picket fences, and perfectly mowed lawns, looked like a photograph from a real estate brochure. Sunlight spilled across the asphalt streets in soft, golden pools, glinting off mailboxes polished to a shine. Birds chirped with mechanical regularity, as if rehearsed for the weekend symphony of suburban life. Yet beneath the picturesque calm, I could feel the undercurrent of tension, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration that something was about to go terribly wrong. I drove up my own driveway, the tires of my black SUV crunching against the gravel. The vehicle was heavy but manageable, an extension of my presence in the world, quiet, contained, yet undeniably forceful. I had lived in Willow Creek for barely 2 months, a recent transplant seeking solitude after years of high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled work. My neighbors didn't know who I was, and that was exactly the way I liked it. Jason Mercer, mild-mannered homeowner. That was the identity I wore like a suit. No one needed to know I was a federal marshal, trained in tactical operations, surveillance, and negotiation, the kind of work that left criminals shaking in their boots long before the badge did. The first sign that my morning was about to derail came in the form of Marlene Whitmore. She was standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, hair dyed a bright copper red that caught the morning sun like a warning flare. Her posture was rigid, the shoulders square, the stance of someone who had spent decades enforcing authority in small doses and petty disputes. She was late 40s, with a smile that never reached her eyes, a woman who took rules as gospel and, in her own mind, interpreted them with divine precision. "Mr. Mercer," she called sharply, her voice cutting through the birdsong like a siren. I paused, resting my hand on the door handle of the SUV. The air between us was already taut, a live wire ready to snap. I noted the flicker of irritation in her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the clipboard like a shield. She was territorial, protective of her HOA fiefdom. She was about to make a grave mistake. "Yes?" I replied evenly, stepping out of the vehicle. My boots crunched against the gravel, each step deliberate, measured, a subtle assertion of presence. "You can't park in the driveway like that," she said, voice rising slightly. "It's against HOA regulations." "I'll have to." Her sentence faltered under my gaze. I could see the internal calculation running through her mind. Is he bluffing? Should I call it in? Or will this escalate beyond anything I can control? I raised a hand, palm outward, an almost casual gesture but with the weight of authority behind it. "Marlene, I'm curious, exactly which regulation am I violating?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. The clipboard rattled in her grip. "Driveways are supposed to be clear of vehicles over 3 tons. Your SUV exceeds that limit." I blinked slowly, letting the words sink in. Amateur. The woman didn't even understand the rule she thought she was enforcing. My Jeep barely scraped 2 tons. It was a blatant overreach, and yet she seemed entirely unaware of the absurdity. "Interesting," I said softly, taking a step closer, the morning sun casting long shadows behind me. "I wasn't aware of that specific rule. Could you show me a citation?" Her hands shook ever so slightly, the veneer of confidence cracking under the pressure of my calm demeanor. I was going to call the police. That's when I decided it was time to escalate, gently, but unmistakably. I leaned in just enough to ensure she registered the seriousness in my tone. "Marlene," I said, voice low and steady, "I am a federal marshal. That means I have certain jurisdictional immunities. You're welcome to call the police, but I suggest you refrain from doing so until you fully understand who you're dealing with." Her jaw dropped. The clipboard nearly slipped from her trembling hands. A federal marshal? You're serious?" I nodded, faintly amused at her horror. "As serious as a subpoena." Her composure faltered entirely. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. I was just doing my duty." I let the silence stretch, thick and oppressive, letting the weight of my words settle like a stone in her stomach. Across the street, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, drawn to the confrontation without understanding the stakes. A car alarm barked somewhere down the lane, a punctuation to the tension that had begun to coalesce like fog around us. Duty, I said finally, each syllable deliberate, is admirable. But understanding authority, jurisdiction, and limits is far more important. Misuse of either can have serious consequences. Her lips quivered. I didn't know. You didn't check the rules, I corrected gently, stepping back. You acted on assumption. That's where the problem lies. I returned to my SUV, the gravel crunching under my boots, every step a reminder that I was calm, measured, and fully aware of the power imbalance. Marlene, clearly shaken, had already reached for her phone. I could hear her fingers fumbling, dialing, reporting a violation that had never existed. She didn't realize she had escalated a minor parking dispute into something far larger than herself. I sat back inside my home, the interior cool and quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The phone rang almost immediately, a dispatcher from the local precinct confirming the complaint. I answered, confirmed my name is Jason Mercer, my voice neutral. The officer on the other end was polite, confused, cautious. They had no idea what they were stepping into. I provided only necessary verification, revealing nothing about my career, my training, or the abilities that allowed me to remain calm while chaos brewed just outside my front window. By mid-morning, I knew the neighborhood would never look at me, or at Marlene, the same way again. I could feel it in the subtle glances from the windows across the street, the tension that stiffened the air around the sidewalks, the unease that spread like a ripple through the perfectly landscaped lawns. Willow Creek was quiet, orderly, picture-perfect, but it was also fragile. One misstep, one assumption, one overreach, and the balance could tip dangerously. I poured a cup of coffee, letting the rich aroma fill the kitchen, a small comfort against the underlying hum of anticipation. The calm of my home contrasted sharply with the storm I had just weathered, but it would not last. Not if Marlene decided to escalate further, not if the HOA continued its petty crusade against me without understanding the consequences. I knew one thing for certain, Willow Creek didn't know who lived among them. And if Marlene or anyone else in the neighborhood wanted to test boundaries, they would soon learn, in ways far more concrete than a conversation across a gravel driveway, that Jason Mercer was not just another homeowner. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, wry smile. The stage was set, the players in position. The quiet suburban morning was about to crack, and I, the unseen Marshal, would be ready when it did. The sun had climbed higher by Saturday afternoon, casting long, accusing shadows over the manicured streets of Willow Creek. The air was thick with heat, the kind that pressed against your skin and made the faint scent of freshly cut grass almost unbearable. Children's laughter echoed in bursts across the cul-de-sacs, mingling with the rhythmic drone of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. On any ordinary day, it was a perfect suburban tableau. But today, it felt more like a stage set for confrontation. Inside my home, I sat in the quiet of my study, feeling the subtle hum of tension vibrate beneath the walls. My morning encounter with Marlene Whitmore, the overzealous HOA president, had spiraled in ways I hadn't anticipated. A simple dispute over driveway parking had escalated into a potential law enforcement intervention, and I knew Marlene would not let it rest. She had called the police, her panic palpable even over the thin veil of authority she tried to maintain. The knock at my front door came sharply, slicing through the quiet with a kind of formal insistence that only law enforcement can carry. I opened the door to find Officer David Bradley, young and earnest, barely past the academy stage. His eyes were wide, polite, uncertain, the kind of rookie who still believes in the black and white simplicity of right and wrong. He held himself stiffly, as if aware that the slightest misstep in my presence could betray inexperience. "Mr. Mercer?" "HOA complaint, parking violation," he asked, voice courteous but wary. I gestured for him to step inside. "Please, come in, officer," I said, keeping my tone neutral, professional. My voice carried the subtle authority of someone accustomed to managing dangerous situations calmly. "Let's have a seat." Inside, I could feel him scanning the room, noting the precise order of books on shelves, the faint scent of brewed coffee, the quiet efficiency that marked my lifestyle. I had learned long ago that people like him observed every detail, hoping for a clue that might validate their assumptions. "They said you refused to move your vehicle and threatened the HOA president," Bradley continued, though his tone wavered slightly. "Miscommunication," I said. "She called you before verifying the rule. My vehicle is well within legal limits. There is no violation. He blinked, confusion flickering across his face. So, she just called us? I nodded. Exactly. That's all. I expect HOA disputes to be handled with verification before escalation. But it seems that didn't happen here. I let my eyes meet his for a moment, holding his gaze just long enough to make him realize the subtle weight of my words. Authority does not always shout. Sometimes it simply exists, and others are compelled to acknowledge it. We spent the next hour together, reviewing the HOA covenants, examining the specific clause she had supposedly cited, and cross-referencing it against local ordinances. Officer Bradley's posture slowly shifted from rigid confidence to cautious humility. He didn't know my history, didn't know the covert operations I'd overseen, the fugitives I had tracked, the stakes of a miscalculated threat. But even without knowing, the presence I carried, the quiet control of my movements and tone, had an undeniable impact. By the time he left, polite apologies offered and notes taken, I could feel the balance of power in this neighborhood subtly realigning. But as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, a different kind of tension emerged. Across the street, I noticed a car parked unusually, headlights dimmed. Two figures sat inside, their voices low, their movements deliberate. They were watching. I stepped onto my front porch, letting the wooden planks creak under my boots, though I made sure each step sounded measured, intentional. The car remained stationary. From the corner of my eye, I caught the faint click of a camera. Someone was documenting my property, someone who had taken Marlene's crusade further than I expected. This was no longer a trivial HOA dispute. This was surveillance. And I did not appreciate being watched. Marlene appeared moments later, clipboard in hand once more, her copper hair catching the fading sunlight. Her face was pale but defiant, a mix of fear and indignation. Jason. I just want to do what's right, she said, voice trembling ever so slightly. I exhaled slowly, keeping my posture relaxed but purposeful, allowing the tension to build. Right, I said, my voice measured, deliberate. You've escalated a minor infraction into harassment. Now someone is surveilling my property. Who else is involved, Marlene? Her composure wavered. She swallowed, looking anywhere but directly at me. I didn't mean. Save it, I interrupted, stepping closer. The sunlight caught the sharp lines of my face, casting shadows that made my calm intensity feel more imposing. This neighborhood has rules, yes. But so do I. You've crossed boundaries that I don't take lightly. If this continues, the HOA will understand what it means to misuse authority. Her hands shook, the clipboard quivering under her grip. I just thought. You thought wrong, I said quietly, almost conversationally. Thinking doesn't replace verification. Assumptions can get people hurt or worse. Across the street, the car's engine purred briefly and then vanished, leaving only an unsettling silence. The suburban hum of sprinklers and distant lawnmowers resumed, but it was different now, taut, uneasy, like a held breath. I could feel the subtle shift in energy. My neighbors hadn't witnessed the surveillance, but the underlying tension was palpable, lingering in the air like static. I returned to my house, every movement deliberate, calculating. In my study, I reviewed communications, checking for any further signs of escalation. Years in the field had taught me that minor provocations often preceded more serious threats. I wasn't going to be caught unprepared. Willow Creek was picturesque, yes, but it was also naive. Its HOA president had made the mistake of underestimating me, and anyone who did that underestimated consequences they couldn't afford to face. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. Phone calls went unanswered, neighbors appeared and disappeared, and the sun sank low, casting the neighborhood in deep orange and purple shadows. Inside, I reviewed files, scanned neighborhood logs, even cross-referenced local news for any patterns that could explain the surveillance. There was nothing, except the unmistakable sign that Marlene had unleashed a chain reaction of her own making. By the time night fell, Willow Creek had reverted to its quiet facade, the street lamps flickering on one by one, washing the cul-de-sacs in pale light. Yet beneath that calm, a tension lingered, as if the neighborhood itself knew something had shifted. The stage was set. The players were positioned. And I, Jason Mercer, federal marshal in disguise, was ready for whatever came next. In the silence of my home, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. I had handled the police, neutralized the immediate threat, and demonstrated authority without unnecessary force. But the surveillance indicated that Marlene's campaign was far from over. Someone in that neighborhood had overstepped, and I would ensure that the lesson they learned was permanent. I poured a second cup of coffee, letting the aroma fill the room. Outside, the moon rose over Willow Creek, casting long, silver shadows across the lawns. In that quiet glow, I could see the outlines of the neighborhood for what it really was, a beautiful, fragile facade, hiding ignorance and overconfidence. And tonight, I thought, as I sipped slowly and listened to the faint rustle of leaves, the balance of power had shifted. This neighborhood had no idea who lived among them. And if anyone thought they could push too far, they would find out soon, and without mercy. By the following Wednesday, Willow Creek's sun had returned to its predictable rhythm, spilling over the trimmed hedges and smooth asphalt streets in soft, golden light. The neighborhood seemed calm, ordinary, peaceful, yet beneath that serene surface, tension lingered like a shadow refusing to dissipate. I had spent the last 2 days preparing for what I knew was inevitable, a confrontation orchestrated by Marlene Whitmore and the HOA board, attempting to assert dominance where they had no right. The community center was modest, tucked between a playground and a cluster of townhouses, but it had an auditorium large enough to accommodate the entire HOA board along with a scattering of concerned neighbors. I arrived early, blending in seamlessly as Jason Mercer, the mild-mannered homeowner who had become, in the past week, the target of an overzealous neighborhood campaign. My black jacket was casual, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, but the quiet intensity radiating from me was unmistakable. Inside, the room hummed with murmurs of anticipation. Neighbors whispered, chairs scraped against the tile floor, and the board members fidgeted as they set up papers and clipboards. Marlene stood at the front, her copper hair catching the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Her confidence, once so rigid and intimidating, now seemed brittle, fractured, as if each step toward confrontation chipped away at the foundation of her authority. "Thank you all for attending on such short notice," Marlene began, her voice slightly strained. She attempted the posture of command, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her unease. We have concerns regarding Mr. Mercer's parking practices. These violations." I stood, the sound of my boots against the tile deliberate, commanding attention without a word. The room fell silent instantly. Eyes turned toward me, some curious, some wary. I let my gaze sweep across the audience, noting the subtle shifts, the board members' hesitant posture, neighbors' uncertain expressions, the faint but unmistakable fear flickering in Marlene's eyes. "I believe a clarification is necessary," I said, my voice calm but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had faced far graver situations than a neighborhood parking dispute. "Your concerns, Marlene, are based on incorrect interpretation of the HOA covenants. My vehicle does not violate any rule. And more importantly, actions taken under misinterpretation of authority have consequences." A few neighbors whispered to one another, surprised by the directness of my tone. Marlene's face paled further. She had expected resistance, but not this level of composure, not this undeniable presence. I just wanted to enforce the rules," she stammered, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "Enforcement requires verification," I replied, stepping closer. The movement was subtle but intentional, ensuring my presence dominated the room. Acting on assumptions or personal interpretation is not enforcement, it is overreach. Misuse of authority can result in liability for both individuals and organizations. The HOA must understand this principle clearly. The room was silent, tension coiling like a live wire in the air. The board members exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware that their previous confidence was fragile. Marlene's shoulders slumped slightly as she struggled to maintain a facade of composure. I apologize," she said finally, her voice small, almost inaudible. I didn't understand the limits." I nodded, letting her words settle. Acknowledgement is the first step. Moving forward, all HOA actions must follow procedure and verification. Personal vendettas, assumptions, or misinterpretations will not be tolerated. You are responsible not just for enforcing rules, but for understanding them correctly. The subtle shift in the room was palpable. Neighbors sat straighter, board members leaned forward, and a few even nodded in quiet agreement. The weight of authority, calm, measured, and undeniable, had changed the balance in Willow Creek. For the first time in years, the HOA had encountered someone whose power didn't rely on position, but on knowledge, experience, and the quiet confidence of real authority. After a few moments of silence, the board president cleared her throat. "Mr. Mercer, on behalf of the board, we will retract our previous complaint and issue a formal apology. We will also review enforcement procedures to prevent future misunderstandings." Marlene's eyes widened, and she looked like she might protest, but she knew better than to argue. The room was calm now, but attention remained, a subtle reminder that actions have consequences and that power, however quietly wielded, could shift dynamics permanently. I inclined my head slightly. Good. That is the correct resolution. The HOA now has a responsibility to follow rules properly and fairly. Anything less would be a breach of trust to the residents you represent. Marlene nodded weakly, her color returning just enough to maintain dignity, though the fear lingered in her eyes. The rest of the room remained quiet, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. As I left the community center, the afternoon sun falling soft and warm over Willow Creek, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. The neighborhood looked unchanged, same houses, same streets, same hum of suburban life, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. Marlene and her board had learned that overreach, ignorance, and arrogance could be corrected, quietly but firmly, without chaos, without violence, but with undeniable authority. Back at my home, I parked my SUV in my driveway without hesitation, the gravel crunching under the tires. The street was quiet, the neighbors seemingly unaware of the storm that had passed between the walls of the community center. Yet I knew the lesson had landed. Willow Creek had seen, felt, and understood that Jason Mercer, the quiet homeowner, was not to be underestimated. I stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against the frame. A faint breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of cut grass and the faint aroma of baking bread from a neighbor's kitchen. Outside, the street resumed its suburban rhythm, children played, sprinklers danced, and the neighborhood returned to its picturesque routine. But beneath that calm, I could feel the residual tension, the unspoken acknowledgement that power could manifest in subtle, devastating ways. I allowed myself a small, private smile. Willow Creek had thought it was a quiet, predictable enclave. They hadn't realized that a federal marshal lived among them. That subtle truth had shifted everything. Authority, properly understood and quietly enforced, had prevailed not through threats or violence, but through clarity, confidence, and undeniable competence. The night fell soft and deep. The street lamps flickered on, casting golden pools of light across the sidewalks. Inside my house, the quiet hum of appliances provided a soothing backdrop as I finally sank into my chair with a sense of completion. The confrontation had ended. The HOA had been corrected. Marlene Whitmore had been humbled. And the neighborhood, for all its beauty and calm, would never again mistake a determined federal marshal for a simple, ordinary homeowner. I looked out my window, across my driveway, at the street that had tested me so unnecessarily. I allowed myself one final thought, quiet but firm: Willow Creek had learned a lesson. And I, Jason Mercer, would be there to ensure it was remembered, not with malice, but with the quiet, uncompromising force of truth and authority.